Hello and welcome to the technical breakdown behind the scenes of the Hololive ERROR translation patch. In case you're interested in, say, making your own patch for a different Unity game, I hope this sort of breakdown is useful to you. You're going to notice that this video uses the YouTube timestamp feature, the chapters thing. If you find, if there's a section you're not really interested in, feel free to use it to skip ahead. I'm going to start by showing you the the preparatory steps for actually being able to edit Unity games. First off, some technical details you need to know. Modern Unity games are usually compiled using what is known as IL2CPP. I'm not going to go into all the details, but just know that it makes editing their asset files a lot more difficult. So the first step is to, of course, check if a game is compiled using IL2CPP. You're going to go into the data folder, and you'll just see that there's quite clearly a folder called IL2CPP_data. This is going to prevent you from editing monobehaviors, which are what Unity uses for a bunch of things. For example, text, effects, basically a lot of things you may be interested in editing. So your first step is going to be to dump the IL2CPP data. As you can see, I've already done this, but essentially you need a tool that's called IL2CPP dumper. You're just going to run it and point it at the IL2CPP data folder. I'll leave the links to all the tools you'll need in the description, by the way. Just run it, point it at the folder. It's going to create another folder, which is, in this case, IL2CPP_dump. This folder is necessary because we're going to have to extract what's known as the type tree from it. And we can't do that if the data isn't dumped. The type tree is what's actually going to enable us to edit monobehaviors. For now, I'm going to show you and link you the script I made and used. Well, I didn't quite make it. I took an existing example, polished it up a bit. Yeah, still, I'll link it in the description. The library I used and I'm using for this patch is known as UnityPy. It's a great library, highly recommended, but be aware that it's very simple to use, but in order to be that simple, you have to trade off some functionality. So for example, you're going to find that it's really difficult to edit certain things such as sprites. Sprites are actually different from textures. You can very easily edit sprites by editing the linked texture. But what you're not going to be able to easily do is, say, change the size of a texture. I'll throw an example up on screen. As you can see, the move text here is very small. That's because the original Japanese text is also really small, and I can't change its size. I've tried using a different tool because there's a different library. It's called, I believe, AssetStudio, AssetTools.net. Yes. It's the library that's used by UAB Avalonia, which is a C# rewrite of Unity Asset Bundle Extractor. It's a lot more complex. It lets you do a lot more things. I've tried using it to edit the sprite, and it still wouldn't cooperate. I'll show you what it looks like if I actually try. It's a mess. But that's besides the point. I'm now going to show you the rest of the steps you'll need to take to edit a game's assets using UnityPy. I'm going to assume you've already dumped the IL2CPP data using the tool I showed you earlier. So now what I'm going to do is use AssetStudio. This is the one I used, but you're also free to use the one I mentioned earlier, UAB Avalonia. I just like this one better, honestly. So I'm just going to load a file. So for Hololive ERROR, I've found that the actual text and monobehaviors, well, the text specifically, is in level 0, and all the textures are in shared assets. I'm just going to open up level 0 for now. As you can see, they actually both get loaded in at the same time, but that's knowing what goes where is sort of, well, it's not really that important, so it doesn't really matter. Point is, you can look through and sort of find, for example, I can look for text, and here you'll see and you'll use the IL2CPP dump we created earlier. This is because in order to read model behaviors, you need to have the dumped IL2CPP data. So I'm just going to select the dummy DLL folder, which the program will create. And that's going to allow me to read the model behaviors. As you can see, all of these are the ones that contain the text for the game. Luckily, they're all named text. You'll see that I'm using an already translated file. Doesn't really matter. Here, I'll show you with the original Japanese one. Just give it a sec. Just gotta do the thing again, and here we are. So, as you'll notice, they're all named text, and they've all got a path ID. One thing to note about the exports that you can do with AssetStudio GUI is that their file names are all structured like this. You have the actual name of the file, followed by a hashtag, and the path ID of the file. This is pretty handy because the path ID is going to allow us to identify which sort of objects we're going to replace when we patch the game. I'm now going to walk you through all the various scripts and code that I used to patch the game. Starting off with the treeDumper. This is a just slightly edited example taken off of the UnityPy repository. Gotta fix the spacing. Essentially what it does is it takes the IL2CPP folder, the dump that is, and it's going to create the typetree.json file we need to properly edit the mono behaviors using the library. AssetStudio GUI, I believe, just does the same thing, but in the background. So, the code is pretty simple. This is the DLL, dummy DLL folder I mentioned earlier. This is the asset path where you can find all the various files. And this is the path where you want to save the tree. What it's going to do is essentially just go through the DLL folder and dump all the sort of data for all of the mono behaviors. Just like I said, you don't really need to know how this works, just know that it does. You can basically just reuse this example wholesale. Now, before showing you, well, anyway, the result of this program is going to be just a very simple typetrees.json file. For the translation patch inside the exe data, it's this one. So, let's switch gears and go take a look at CSV to JSON. This is a tool which is more useful for translators than anything. But essentially, it's going to take a tab-separated CSV file, also sometimes called a TSV file. For example, if you are working in Google Documents in their whatever version of Excel is called, you can export it as a tab-separated file. For example, you can simply open this up and say LibreOffice Calc. If you do use LibreOffice Calc to edit it, you're going to want to use exactly these settings. Of course, it has to be separated by tab values, but that's the LibreOffice is going to figure it out by itself. The very important thing is that string delimiter must be empty. This is because both double quotes and single quotes are used in the various strings of the game. So you don't want to mess up the file. The structure of the file has to be something like this. the file you can find inside resources for translators actually has, I actually didn't include that here. I'll include it later before releasing. Point is, it's a file where the first column has the IDs, the second column has the Japanese text, and then there's nothing else. The important part when creating a TSV file that gets fed into the Python script is that the first column must be the IDs, and the rightmost column must be the translated text. What's in between doesn't matter. It just looks at the first and the rightmost column. Now, as for the script itself, as I mentioned, it's pretty easy. It's just going to let you pick which file. It's going to write it out to subtitles.json. And the only sort of special part of this is this one. As you can see, it writes a special line which says, do not edit this line. This is something I will explain in a bit when I walk you through the code of editAssets. Speaking of which, let's do just that. This is also taken from a different sort of script, which I modified a bit, like I said, slightly different, but not completely. I'll link, of course, this script, all these scripts you can find in the GitHub repository, and I'll also link the scripts I based my own off of. This simply tells the program which types of assets you want to edit. Sprites are actually not necessary. Sorry, I left that uncommented. These are just a bunch of global variables that get used. And yeah, here's the credit for the file I based this off of. So the first part of main is sort of just figuring out if it's in the correct folder, finding if the translation patch folder is present and in the right spot, if the data folder is there. This is a debug feature that's used for translators. Essentially, what it does is I'll throw up an example on screen. It's going to print the ID of the text alongside the text itself. This makes it easier to reference, okay, this is that line. So you don't have to look at the text itself. It just makes it a bit easier. It's something that the translator asked me. And yeah. This just is going to list all the subfolders within translation patch, except for the exe data and the debug overrides folder. The exe data just contains the editAssets program itself and the typetrees.json file. The debug overrides folder is something different. I'm going to explain it when we get to the code that actually uses it. Oh, and of course it's going to check if the JP files are present. Essentially, when the script runs, it's going to take the original files and just move them to the same file name _JP to keep them saved in case you want to revert to Japanese or you want to change languages at any point. Now, debug overrides. The way it works is that if you have a folder called debug overrides in translation patch, it's going to read through and take a look at all the JSON files, which are structured in the same way that the dumps from AssetStudio are. So name, hashtag, path ID, and it's just going to completely replace the files that correspond to those IDs with the version you put in this folder. It's not used in the actual release version of the patch. It's something I used to help me debug things, because I didn't want to have to write code for every single file I wanted to edit. And this just made it a lot easier, because I could just copy the version from the AssetStudio dump, put it in debug overrides, edit it, and it would get applied. This is just, okay, this bit is going to look into the texture overrides folder of whatever translation you chose to use. So let's go for English in this example. So translation patch, English, texture overrides. As you can see, this contains all the various textures that we're going to modify. You'll recognize, of course, the file name structure. It's the name, hashtag, the path ID. The structs path variable just simply points to typetrees.json, the file we created earlier. Now, for every file in the list of files to edit, in this case, it's simply, let me find it, level 0 and shared assets 0, because these are the only files, the only asset files which contain any assets we're interested in modifying, is going to run through and essentially edit all the assets. Now, what it does, this is a bit weird. This is a line supposed to fix a weird bug I found. I think it's a bug, I'm not sure. Point is, if you download UnityPy yourself and run the scripts directly, you'll notice that it keeps throwing up an error saying something like global game managers.assets not found, despite the fact that it is in the correct folder and nothing actually goes wrong despite that error. I patched it out in the version that I include with the patch for the Windows version, but, you know, be aware. This is just code I took from the existing example. It does some stuff with sprite and textures to ensure that they're edited correctly, because like I said, sprites and textures are linked, but also not the same thing. It's a bit complicated. You can safely ignore it since we're not really interested in editing sprites. And of course, once a file is fully edited, it's just going to save it. Now, for the actual overriding itself, it's going to, of course, load the typetrees.json file if it's not already loaded, and it's also going to load the subtitles.json file. This, you can find it alongside the texture overrides folder, and it's simply a, let me find it, a list of, it's a JSON file with the keys being the path IDs and the values being the translated text. Now, actually, if you look at this file, you'll notice that there's a fair few further down near the bottom lines which aren't used. 2 of these are actually spoken by Sora during the chase scene, but for whatever reason they don't have a corresponding subtitle. That is, the text does exist in the files, but it's just not used. I tried checking out the subtitles and they're enabled. So what I believe happened is that there just isn't a trigger for it. Don't ask me why, there just isn't. Besides that, yeah, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much all it has. Oh, right. Like I said, a couple of them are actually present, but a lot of them aren't. It seems like the game was supposed to have a lot more dialogue than it actually ended up having. Feel free to read through the file and figure, like, take a look at all the stuff that isn't actually implemented in the game. This line is actually sort of interesting. I'll talk about it more later, but actually, yeah, I'll leave it for later. It's related to that do not edit this line. So going along with the code again, simply going to find all the mono behaviors, check if the path ID is found in subtitles.json, otherwise it's just going to keep going. If it does find it, it's going to use the type tree to actually read it, edit it, and yep, it's going to basically look at the JP text and replace it with the translated text. Right, actually, this part of the code never runs. This is because this part of the code is the one that's meant for games which aren't compiled using IL2 CPP. So the ones where you can just simply read the mono behaviors directly. This is the code that actually runs for Hololive ERROR. This is the bit that looks if there's a corresponding file in the debug overrides folder. Otherwise, yeah, okay, here. This is the special case. In the game, I'll throw up the clip on screen. There is that section with the Blackboard where the text slowly appears. I was actually able to find the text itself in the files. This is it, by the way. And it turns out only the first part is actually used. The die bit is never actually like shown on the Blackboard. But as it actually turns out, this file is not where the text is. After doing some searching, some Googling on how you can achieve this sort of typewriter effect, it turns out that the way you do it is you take an existing text object and modify the text that's inside it. Problem is, the way whoever Cover hired to make the game did it was that they hard-coded the line in the code of the game itself, which I can't edit. Luckily, by looking at the text effect file, which is the file that actually handles this effect, I was able to find the corresponding the text object that gets its text modified, essentially. By the way, something you'll notice, the path ID here is 226604, whereas the path ID here is 226603. For whatever reason, AssetStudio dumps out files with an ID that's one lower than it's actually supposed to be. Don't ask me why, but UnityPy does the same thing. So you can just sort of keep using the when it comes to like coding, you can just use the path ID that UnityPy reports, because it's going to be the same as AssetStudio's. But just be aware if you're manually reading through the files that you might have to subtract one from the path ID if you're trying to find a corresponding file. So anyway, this file basically just gets edited and this text gets replaced with the actual translation instead of, being empty. The do not edit this line bit. This actually, the ID you can see here corresponds to text effect. Now, what it does is, as soon as it finds the line corresponding to text effect, instead of like trying to find the text, it's just going to disable the effect. You'll notice this when you actually play through the patch, but there is no typewriter effect. That was sort of the only way I could do it, sadly, because otherwise I just couldn't translate the text on the Blackboard. A bit of a bummer, but hey, I do what I can. Other than that, this text just checks and does its thing, replaces the text. There's one more special case, which is this ID. It's the red text that you can see here in the startup sort of warning screen. The thing is, if you translate the text into English, the vertical spacing is off, as is the horizontal spacing actually, which is why if you look at the subtitles file, you'll notice that, for example, horror has a bunch of spaces before it. That's to try and fix the spacing and have it actually be in the correct spot. Yada, yada, yada. This checks if you enabled the printing of the sort of subtitle IDs alongside the text itself. And if so, it does its thing. This is just fucking stupid. There's some encoding jank going on. Don't look at it. It's ugly. I'm sorry. I just couldn't be arsed to figure out how to fix it properly. Other than that, it's just going to save it. And yep. Now, this is the bit that handles textures. If it finds the textures in the T2D JSON, which actually I forgot to mention. This is generated by going in the texture overrides folder and looking at the IDs within all the file names. There's something to keep in mind. Anyway, if it finds it, it's just going to open the image and replace the texture with the translated one. Pretty simple stuff. And yeah, this was just a test I did to try and change the size of the move text to make it a little bigger so you could read it better. Sadly, it didn't work. But yeah, like I said, it didn't work even when I tried to use UAB Avalonia to actually edit it. It did change the size, but the texture just looked like a garbled mess. So I sort of gave up. Who cares, essentially. That's mostly it. Just a couple last sort of final notes. The patch game BAT that you can find here in the actual release version is literally just this. It just calls the compiled version of editAssets, which, by the way, I used PyInstaller, if you were wondering, to make an exe out of the Python script. The same thing goes for the CSV to JSON file. Ooh, actually, speaking of this folder, the book file, well, all of this information is also in the README, but the book Blender file essentially contains the book model and a camera, which is positioned to, sorry, let me just take a sip of water. Yeah. A camera which is positioned in a way that sort of mimics the way the original screenshots or the background image were taken. I'll put a visual up on screen, but it's when you see the image that goes in the background when you're reading a note off of the magazine or something else. It's just a very simple sort of Blender file. There's actually a texture missing. Oops. Well, there you are. And yeah. Oh, and of course, you've got the Photoshop files. Both for English and Indonesian, these contain, well, of course, they're the Photoshop files Tungsten generously gave me that he used to edit the textures and translate them. That's about it. I hope this was informative in case you're interested in patching other Unity games. If you need any further assistance with the UnityPy library, you can go to the actual UnityPy Discord. I'm also in there. They were really nice and really helpful with helping me figure out how to make everything work. So yeah, thanks for listening to my rambling, and bye-bye. Hope you enjoyed the patch.